Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
The first big city to fall was Kunduz. One after another, Afghanistan's biggest cities outside of Kabul were captured. Herat to the west.
Terrorists in Kabul carrying out the deadliest attack on U.S. troops in over a decade.
Afghanistan is lost.
Freedom came under attack. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
At my direction, a small team of Americans carried out the operation with extraordinary courage. They killed Osama bin Laden.
Al-Baghdadi is dead.
It's time to end America's longest war. We'll do it responsibly.
Rushing to the airport, behind them, the sound of gunfire.
Deliberately.
Countless Afghans who helped American troops were left behind.
And safely.
Afghans by the thousands desperate to escape life under the Taliban.
Today I'm talking to the executive director of the ACLJ, who also happens to be my brother, Jordan Sekulow. Jordan is an attorney and host of Sekulow, a syndicated radio program providing cutting analysis of today's political and legal landscape with elected officials and conservative leaders. Jordan serves as a liaison between the ACLJ and its international affiliates. He's engaged in high-level legal and policy discussions with leaders and government officials regarding human rights issues around the world. It's October 5th, 2021. I'm joined today by the executive director of the ACLJ and my brother, Jordan Sekulow. Jordan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start this whole series, and I definitely wanted to interview you and our dad because people don't know necessarily of how deeply and how originally we were involved in a lot of this. But your professional career nearly began simultaneously with the September 11th attacks now 20 years ago. You were in D.C., so let's kind of recount some of those experiences, what that was like to be on the ground. And where were you working at the time?
George W. Bush had been elected president. I ended up in Washington, D.C., and I was an intern at the Department of Justice. Not very long, because the school semester that just started, I'd already spent about a year in Washington. So this was again, very early though. We were young, and when this happened, I think it paralyzed most of the country. But Washington, there was nowhere else to go. So if you were kind of in the heart of these matters, especially if you were 18 or 19 years old, and in a city, likely unlike most other places, but Washington, it means that you're not near home. That could mean different things for different people, but at least you're not going to just hop in a car. You probably don't have a car, and the city was locked down. So just the immediate resilience was, we're not going to cancel school for a week. It was one day. It was a bad day, but because all these kids were stuck in Washington, D.C., you could shut down offices, you could close down airports, but you couldn't just tell them to just
go home. Yep.
There was no home for them to get to, especially without airports. So what happened was we went back to class and trying to figure out exactly, you try to process this at the time when you're young, and so you're experiencing it all firsthand, but also maybe not the gravity of the situation because you're young and a freshman in college.
Yeah, and a few years later, you were working in political campaigns, working for the Bush campaign, the re-election campaign. 2004. You were running Students for Bush. The topic of the war on terror had become probably the number one topic that people were talking about. The original Bush campaign, we talked about this with John Ashcroft and with Rick Grinnell, was the compassionate conservative. And by the time we roll around to 2004, the Bush campaign was running on the war on terror. So was war a topic that you could bring up to youth in 2004 and it be resonating?
So obviously the Afghanistan, and that had occurred before we started running for re-election. One of John Kerry's talking points was this shadow campaign, and it started spreading all over college campuses, is that George W. Bush was going to reinstate the draft.
Right, I remember that. That was a big deal.
This was a real issue that we had to address head on. We had to put a statement out. And I remember that addressing that for the first time, because we were America was going to war on a major scale most of us had never seen before. The Gulf War, short and very small. We weren't going inside Baghdad, and this was a multiple front. We weren't just, we're talking about Afghanistan, but then of course with Iraq too. For most of this generation, they went to war. This was normal for all of us. It became our new normal. The idea of radical Islamic terrorists, the idea of suicide acts of violence. This was all pretty new inside the United States. But then all of the focus, like you were talking about, the political campaigns, everything was about had somehow related back to 9/11 or the wars or the conflicts. So the debates that we're having now about how should we handle Afghanistan and what should we do, those were debates raging then, about Iraq and whether or not that was the right decision. And I think the one thing no one had a question about was that we had to go into Afghanistan, we had to eventually hunt down Osama bin Laden, and that however long that mission took, we were going to be committed to it.
Yeah, but the timelines are in sync, almost oddly, with President Bush's campaign and what ended up being the September 11th attacks. And now you have that conversely with the Biden administration taking over 9 months later, having this disaster of a withdrawal in Afghanistan. But you've talked about on the air that there has been calls for, can we unite in this country again? I think we saw a little taste of that with people not necessarily uniting around a presidency, but maybe uniting against policy and action that was taking place.
But there was a moment in Washington that reminded me of when I was a kid at school when 9/11 occurred, and that was when Osama bin Laden was killed. The reaction it was a lot of college kids in Washington, D.C. who filled up the streets. Now at the time, and that was a decade in, at the time, a lot of them were very young children. They were alive when the 9/11 attacks occurred, but they were talking about the idea that they didn't really experience it. Now we have to imagine there's entire generations we have to keep telling these stories to, because what may seem very real to us and very easy to recall the events, that if you don't talk about these difficult stories, they will be forgotten, and you end up with who's going to write the history. And ultimately, I think that the closest we've gotten back to a time through all the politics of this was when Osama bin Laden was killed. It didn't matter who the president was. It was a celebration. It wasn't an end to the war against terror or trying to figure out defining what that means, but it was certainly a moment where we all came together.
Came together for that, but now in the converse, we have a very divided nation who maybe came together slightly to say the images coming out of Afghanistan were horrendous in the last month. Is that something you think politically, as someone who was a political strategist involved in this, is that something that we can maybe rally around, which is Americans look at that kind of imagery and say, this is too far, this is not how we handle things?
I think because it was 20 years of conflict, it touched so many people. There are so many families of veterans, so many people, not necessarily who lost their lives, so there's certainly people who did, and those families, but there were so many parts of this giant apparatus, and that's why politically you might be able to say, well, a small conflict here or an attack here, people don't usually vote on these foreign policy decisions. I think this is different because of how many people are related to this story. Everybody's got their experience, but when you're talking to these military families, those days, this was the beginning. 9/11 was the beginning of what was maybe a new experience. You couldn't judge where this was going. You didn't know how it was going to turn out.
Do we need to hold people in Washington accountable for the last few months, and how do we hold them accountable? Is it something that there are political actions taking place, or is it something where, as you've said many times, that elections have consequences, and we need to remember that?
You have to remember the elections have consequences, and you got to do something about it. So, I don't think that, again, we're a polarized country, and it's easy now to get the access to information. You can go right to your phone. You could dial up whatever history you want, whatever information you want. But ultimately, people have they have to hold all these individuals accountable at the ballot box and the party that they represent, the people that empower them as well.
What about from the ACLJ point of view? As executive director from the ACLJ, a lot of people turn to us when there are times of crisis, whether it's religious freedom, which, look, part of this in the war in Afghanistan, part of the reasons we were fighting was for religious freedom for people, something that they had for 20 years and sadly don't have now. But what can members of the ACLJ do, and what do you do at the ACLJ to actively respond when situations like this happen, including obviously spreading the word through the media?
Well, I think this whole idea, and what we're dealing with as a country, this is, don't take for granted that everybody is an expert in the world affairs or what's going on in the Islamic world. I think there was a wake-up call to a lot of people. We'd seen acts of terror before from Al-Qaeda, targeted at U.S. embassies, U.S. troops, but it was always overseas. When terrorism came home to the United States, and it started recruiting Americans to carry out these attacks from communities, various communities where people were feeling isolated. And then you juxtapose that with the Trump administration putting forward the Abraham Accords, right, and the peace agreements, working together with countries like Saudi Arabia. A lot changes in 20 years. But I think what it did was it woke, including the ACLJ, the national security practice of the ACLJ, these laws, how do these laws affect us at home, and the actions we take abroad, and the international work, the ACLJ. We have been a country at war for my entire career at the ACLJ. Most of my entire life was a nation at war. So what did that mean? I think it meant something different for our generation. It was not maybe as divisive as Vietnam and some of the more recent conflicts that were at this scale. But ultimately, part of the ACLJ's mission now, taken for granted to an extent, is not just calling out radicalism and supporting religious liberty, but doing so in the toughest places in the world.
Well, and you bring up that the media in general has painted a picture of conservatives the last 5 years as people who are not compassionate, people who see situations that are going on and are just doing it for themselves and are selfish people. However, you always see the outcry from the conservative leaders and not necessarily from the liberal leaders when things like Afghanistan happen, when there's a crisis at the border. We see the humanitarian side of it, but the media has seemed to not only push that narrative, but is winning. And that's a problem with politics in general, is they are winning these wars in painting people as, these evil, conservatives who don't care about people, when it really always feels like the converse when you see it from at least your point of view.
The biggest problem with Washington, and a lot of these actors, and when I say Washington, you've got the Democrat elected officials, but you have the entire bureaucracy that pretty much agrees with them, or it goes with their policy. It is callous and cold when it comes to warfare. Some of that, I think a government has to be, and I understand that to an extent. You can't operate if you are hamstrung by your emotions all the time.
Can't all be emotions, yeah.
But the lack of empathy, the lack of emotions from those who consider, the liberal idea, this idea of, we want peace, but you will criticize this country, but we don't criticize this country. I think that conservatives actually have a much more even-handed approach to the issues of human rights, and it's not pick and choose. Washington's very pick and choose. You can focus in on one country's human rights abuses because it's helping a political narrative, but then you ignore another country's. I mean, China is the perfect example of that right now, where on the books we're saying they're committing genocide. We're not doing anything about it.
When there's victories, it seems like within conservative ranks, look, I'll say this for maybe one of few complaints of the Trump 2020 campaign was to not keep bringing up the fact that just before this, before the Trump administration, we were dealing with ISIS in a real way. Then ISIS was decimated. The Abraham Accords, like you said, happened. But when it came to the debate stage, they seemed to never come up. It never came up because it had almost become ancient history very quickly, because it seems like people move on too fast from our successes, and we don't say, hey, look, this is what happens. And we were saying it on the air, and I was saying it privately to people that, look, when the Biden administration took power, give it a year, we're going to be back where we were, because people forget, and they forget too easy. But not only that, we sometimes don't bring it up enough. You take the win and you move on. But you need to remind people, or this is what ends up happening.
We as a country took on radical Islamic terrorism, and we were told the entire time, don't use this word, or don't call them Muslims, or don't say Islam. But at the end of the day, throughout all of this conflict and through all the fighting, what ultimately happened in the Islamic world? Well, the Islamic world came to the table to this historic peace accords, not just with the United States. We're a big country. Most countries want to make peace with us and have a financial relationship with us. But they were doing so with Israel. These were the countries that a decade before that were funding terrorist attacks against Israel. And while there's still problems with that in the Middle East, and certainly with countries like Iran, they are being isolated now as the Islamic radicals. And the Muslim world, I think, stepped up to some extent as well, with our position that we got to call out the problem. We have to understand what it is that we're dealing with. But I think that's what we don't wish on. Policy-wise, we don't want to live through that again in America. I don't want to wake up every day feeling like, is there going to be a terrorist attack? Is there going to be, inspired by what occurred on 9/11. So it's a constant reminder of what you're battling against, which is a dangerous ideology. You mentioned ISIS. There was no ISIS on 9/11. So the radicals had to start a more radical group to compete with each other. But yet now the Taliban's back in control.
When you went around the country, with talking about the Taliban, you went around the country with the Bush campaign, and obviously the Taliban was not a term used casually, was not used with respect, but now we're seeing that, and we're seeing that now coming from our own government, using the Taliban as just part of our lexicon, as something we have to deal with. It. They're a legitimate government, according to our government now. How does that make you feel as someone who spent so many of your years actively talking about how negative this form?
We didn't make that distinction. So this distinction that is now kind of pounded into everybody's, like you said, the lexicon is that, well, the Taliban's not Al-Qaeda. That was not a distinction that was heavily made early on when these conflicts began. The idea was, if you are harboring these groups, if you are allowing them to operate and planning attacks against the United States, the attacks on our embassies, the attacks on the USS Cole, and then ultimately the 9/11 attacks, that you're the same. You know, that idea criticized at the time, with us or against us, no in between. There was no in between. And now, yes, things get more complicated 20 years out. Yes, you have to reassess your policies. But that's why it's difficult, I think, for a lot of people to swallow, is this idea that we didn't make all these very fine Washington State Department diplomatic distinctions between, well, that mullah was not really the Al-Qaeda, he was just someone who harbored Al-Qaeda. Everyone was an enemy or an ally. And I think it did make things clear. Things get more complicated as you get further out from the main events, but that is why I think still to this day, many of those actors, unfortunately, it's the second generation of the Taliban that we're bringing back to power, who weren't in power. You know, it feels like we brought them back by our own actions, that they weren't naturally just going to waltz in and take this kind of power if we had fought back.
Yeah, and these mistakes continue to happen. You see something like the ISIS-K, what they say, attack that happened in Afghanistan, and then we responded with the drone strike that we all know now was, as they kind of have claimed, a terrible mistake. It doesn't bring a lot of trust to the American people, and it clearly adds fuel to the fire of what's going on overseas. That's not something to easily, it's not Soleimani, which they take out, and there was people in the streets here, immigrants who had come in who were praising that. But when you know, oh, we made a mistake, we accidentally sent a drone that killed many children, it's not exactly calming things worldwide.
There were times in Iraq, obviously, war is not perfect. No. It is not pretty, and it is horrible things happen, and including civilian casualties. But it feels like with these administrations, what happens, it feels out of control. Yeah. That on the ground, a country that we were occupying for 2 decades, like that or not.
Yeah, until 60 days ago or less.
Right, we were in full control. You didn't move unless we said you could move. You didn't take a step unless the U.S. said you could take a step. We were the guys in control, and the men and women who served our military. So that idea of that crisis feeling or the chaos feeling, unfortunately, I think that these administrations bring on themselves, and then we have to deal with the pieces. It feels like of the broken Military. We talked about that a lot 4 years ago. The idea that the military was destroyed by Barack Obama. They took remember that they were talking about taking hammers to the Pentagon, and then the rebuilding under the Trump years, all for naught to some extent in Afghanistan.
This obviously was a horrible withdrawal, a terrible mess. But as a society, look, a lot of things are going on in the country. We're still dealing with the COVID crisis. We're still dealing with the border crisis. It's easy to move on. This happened, again, I feel like with the Abraham Accords and with the destruction of ISIS, we can move on too far and not be able to remind people of what happened. And when we get into more election cycles, when we get into more things like this, how do you, as a political strategist and someone who's involved deeply in that, how do we keep this topic in the conversation? I mean, we're doing pieces like this to hopefully remind people of what it felt like, because 2-3 years from now, it's going to be easy to forget if things get quiet.
I actually think the reason why I stayed in politics so long was because of 9/11. I mean, it was because of these attacks. It was because of the wars that started. Everything that happened in the news felt very real, and it felt like you could kind of reach out and touch it. I think you have to harness that anger for good. The response, obviously, the resolve, that's kind of, you see it in the first hand. But second is, you have to continue to tell these stories. You have to tell people what it was really like, what you were actually dealing with, because the narrative will be written by someone else if not. And then I think you're just doomed to repeat the same problems.
How we wrap up all of these, I'll wrap up with you as well, is to talk about all of the people who for the last 20 years who are maybe looking at this, the families of fallen soldiers, or people who lost limbs, lost lives, lost mental battles, or who just were deeply impacted by the war in the last 20 years. They're certainly looking at this going, was this all worth it? Was this all in vain? And I think it's important always, as we wrap up each one of these interviews, to remind people that the last 20 years was not wasted and these lives were not wasted.
Absolutely not. We killed Osama bin Laden. We took out ISIS. We took out Al-Qaeda at the time. We took out ultimately the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. We isolated countries like Iran. We befriended other countries. We brought other Gulf states out. There were huge gains made. Yeah. And many of these can be salvaged. I think that's why the moment is now. Because to salvage these gains, you've got to act fairly quickly, or else you're going to be in the situation, like you said, where you're talking about what could have been or what should have been instead of what was.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks.